There are forces of good and forces of evil at work in the world today. What are these forces? Who is responsible for the good? And who is responsible for the evil? Richard Schaff talks about current events which are rarely discussed by the mainstream media, events that affect us all. This program seeks to identify, to inform, and to equip the believer for what's ahead. Welcome to What in the World is Going On?
This is What in the World is Going On. I'm your host, Richard Schaff, program sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes. We are pro-Christian, pro-American, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment. And folks, we're here by the grace of God. A brief look at the international scene. Let's go over to Hong Kong for a minute. It appears that this past week that Beijing might have folded on that extradition law. But a lot of people are thinking the genie's already out of the bottle. There's been a lot of growling from Beijing about how the communist regime wouldn't sit on its hands over the massive protests, those that are disrupting down in Hong Kong, and now show threats of no mercy to the protesters. But this past week, the Chi Kung appeared to have folded. Hong Kong's Beijing-appointed puppet leader, Carrie Lam, has withdrawn the extradition bill that triggered the protest. That's the one that permitted Beijing to freely snatch back anyone who displeases Red China, and then you'd face Chinese justice in the communist dictatorship. Well, that's withdrawn. Carrie Lam said last Wednesday that the government would withdraw that contentious extradition bill, and that is what ignited the protest months ago. It's been the worst political crisis since the former British colony returned to Chinese control over 22 years ago. This move eliminates a major objection among protesters, but it's unclear if it'd be enough to bring an end to the intensifying demonstrations. They're now driven by multiple grievances within the government. Incidents over these past 2 months have shocked and saddened Hong Kong people. This according to Lam in an 8-minute televised statement broadcast this past week. She said, and I quote, "We're all very anxious about Hong Kong, our home. We all hope to find a way out of the current impasse and unsettling times," end quote. Her decision comes as the protests near the 3-month mark and show little sign of abating. It's a striking concession from Beijing, but a lot of people on the inside seem to think it's probably too little too late. These protests have engulfed Hong Kong. They've morphed into cries for full democracy, something that has to be Beijing's worst nightmare. As Austin Bay, citing the reporting of Michelle Yan on the ground in Hong Kong, has noted, the protests have moved well into the realm of civil unrest. The whole world has seen how they've featured American flags, the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner, and signs calling for a Second Amendment. Young Hong Kong leaders have turned up in Taiwan with talks about taking in refugees. Even leftists in the states have started scolding each other for not taking a more assertive stand on standing up for the Hong Kongers. The other thing worth noting is that this is Beijing's nightmare, and it's far from over. The protests not only have engulfed Hong Kong, but they're actually no longer about Hong Kong. The Chinese citizens have been caught up sneaking over the border into Hong Kong for no other reason than to join the protest. It's spreading, folks. The impact on the protests have already spread far into the Chinese interior and even into Taiwan. Gordon Chang, probably the most astute Hong Kong observer, notes this: a genie seems to be out of the bottle. Beijing is going to have a hard time putting it back in, his quote. Now to the U.S., our Senator McConnell says the GOP will fill the Supreme Court seat by 2020 if it becomes open. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said Republicans would go ahead and fill a Supreme Court vacancy in 2019 or 20 if necessary. He argued that circumstances are different now than they were in 2016 when the party held a seat open. McConnell had blocked Barack Obama's pick for the High Court, Merrick Garland, from getting a hearing. You remember that? Well, anyway, now McConnell maintained there was a divided government in 2016, but it's not one in 19 or 20 because the GOP controls both the White House and the Senate. He points out you have to go back to 1880 to find the last time that the Senate of a different party from the president filled a Supreme Court vacancy created in the middle of a presidential election. McConnell pointed this out on Hugh Hewitt's radio show last Tuesday. He said, and I'm quoting McConnell, "There was nothing I did that would not have been done had the shoe been on the other foot, had there been a Republican president and a Democrat Senate." So, look, they can whine about this all day, but under the Constitution, there's no co-responsibility for appointments. The president makes the nomination and the Senate confirms. We are partners in the personnel business up to and including the Supreme Court. A direct quote from Senator McConnell. Another thing that I liked this week, it came from Hannity's staff, where they pointed out that Senator Graham had asked the Attorney General, he called on him to release a series of documents related to allegations of widespread FISA abuse during the 2016 election. He pointed out that, Graham did, that the American people have a right to view the, quote, complete results, end quote, of the Inspector General's investigation. Since March 28, 2018, the Department's Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, has been conducting an investigation into the Department's and the Federal Bureau's investigations compliance with legal requirements and with applicable Department and FOB policies and procedures in applications filed with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, that's FISCA. According to the Inspector General, David Horowitz, the investigation is nearing completion. Senator Graham, wrote in a letter to the Attorney General, and I'm going to read it to you, in order for the Inspector General to be able to present the most complete results of his investigation to Congress and the American people, certain documents will need to be declassified and released to the public. I write to urge you to declassify all documents the Inspector General identifies as appropriate for declassification as much as possible without harming national security, end quote, from Senator Graham. Wouldn't it be nice if we could find out? Let the marbles fall, folks. And former House Leader Newt Gingrich says the Dems are playing with fire as the party turns even more left. He said the Democrats are playing with fire as the party continues moving further to the left, as race continues for the party's challenger to President Trump. Newt Gingrich said last Thursday that comparing the current race to the 72 Democrat campaign would give us an idea of what they're facing. I think the Democrats have a challenge. Biden told Fox News Mornings with Maria, quote, "If you were thinking strategically, you would say that Vice President Joe Biden is probably their best candidate against Trump, but he has the same problem that Ed Muskie had in 72, when Muskie should have been the Democrat nominee, but was much more moderate than their final choice, George McGovern." He pointed out that the Washington Post printed a story recently noting that Biden made, quote, 7 mistakes in 3 minutes, end quote, claiming that the story pointed to doom for Biden. When the Post does that to you, then your days as a Democrat frontrunner are beginning to be numbered, according to Gingrich. Meanwhile, Senator Elizabeth Warren is emerging as a very formidable candidate who's, quote, organized, structured, and remembers everything, end quote. So the contrast between her and Biden will be interesting. But, folks, she is a very radical leftist candidate. Gingrich also pointed out that the controversial statements that Warren had made involving claims of being a Native American were going to be shrugged off by the people now that the age of the Kardashians and in the age of Donald Trump. Her policies, though, lean left and are a direct threat to average Americans. And another report came out pointing out that Elizabeth Warren's mounting popularity is concerning some GOP strategists. Republican strategists are growing anxious as Senator Elizabeth Warren's campaign for the Democrat presidential nominee picks up steam. They question, they question why there's so little critical coverage of the Massachusetts senator and why other stories about her are making no dent. In other words, nobody's following up on them. They don't grow any legs. Nothing happens. Opposition researchers pour through reams of material about her. We all push the bad Warren stories, but they don't go very far, one operative said. And they fear President Trump may already have taken his best shots about her claims of being Native American, and Warren will look formidable for having bounced back. Sure, Republicans will ultimately loathe Warren, but she doesn't inspire the same kind of historic feelings and dislike that Hillary Clinton did. This according to another Republican strategist. That combined with the fact that the Supreme Court is not on the line as it was in 16, and remembering that Trump needed to had to perfect an inside straight to barely win last time, and any Democrat's going to be tough to beat, Warren included. Incidentally, I'd like to point out there may or may not be another Supreme Court justice in the making, but there's a whole lot of other justices that he's pointing, and he's really filling the bench with some conservatives. Well, anyway, getting back to the Warren situation, there's been a dramatic change in how Warren is talked about now. Republicans, including Trump, are no longer laughing her off. According to the Daily Beast, Trump has told advisors he hears that Warren could be tougher in a general election than many had thought. That, folks, needs to be taken into consideration. Let's not sell that lady short. All of the 2020 Democrat candidates literally seek trillions of dollars in government spending for climate policies. I don't know whether any of you ever looked at this last week, the debacle that I guess it was CNN had where they were all talking about climate change. Do you realize how much money they were wanting to spend? Democrat presidential primary candidates previously on board with the Green New Deal are now unveiling new climate change plans designed to restructure the energy industry, the economy, and it's literally going to take trillions of dollars in government spending. This according to a Wall Street Journal report. The plans of Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, Mayor Pete, they all came out ahead of that 7-hour CNN town hall debate on climate change. It was held last Wednesday. I did not watch it. I couldn't stand it. I think I watched 3 minutes, but I did read some reports on it. Well, Democratic primary frontrunners Biden and Bernie Sanders had already released their plans, which include trillions in government investment. The pay-fors include fines, fees on polluters, cutting hundreds of billions of dollars on fossil fuel subsidies, reallocating discretionary spending from existing programs, and asking Congress to authorize new expenditures. While Democrats are almost unilaterally on board about the spending increase while damaging the economy, it's going to be a tough sell on Republicans. The CNN Climate Change Town Hall featured each of the 10 top Democrat candidates that qualified for the primary debate later this month, speaking individually in 30-minute or 40-minute blocks. There we had former Rep. Beto O'Rourke, Senator Amy Klobuchar, entrepreneur Andrew Yang, and former HUD Secretary Julian Castros. They have already qualified the debate to be hosted by ABC News on September 12th. Want to look at something? This is just one example of the insanity that these Dems are trying to pull and how it is really insane. Yang came up with this $1,000 a month for everybody over 18. Who's going to pay for it? You and I, folks. Yeah. Well, California, there's a city out there, Stockton, that tests this buzzy campaign idea for income. Democrat presidential candidate Andrew Yang wants to give cash to every American each month. Remember that? I think it's $1,000 a month once you turn 18 for everybody for life. Well, now they've got a special program out in California. Susie Garza displays the city-provided debit card she receives monthly in a trial program in Stockton, California. Garza is participating in the, quote, Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. The program, which started in February, gives her $500 a month, also to a total of 125 people who earn at or below the median household income of slightly over $46,000 a year. In other words, you qualify if you're making less than $46,000 a year. They can spend the money with no restrictions, according to the mayor. He initiated the privately funded program, and he says it could be a solution to the city's poverty program. Anyway, Susie Garza never heard of Yang, but since February, she's been getting $500 a month from a nonprofit in Stockton, California. It's part of an experiment, wouldn't you know, in California, that offers something unusual in presidential politics. What is it? It's a trial run of a campaign promise highlighting the benefits and challenges in real time. Garza can spend the money however she wants. Listen to this. She uses 150 of it to pay for her cell phone. She used another 100 or so to pay off her dog's vet bill. She spends the rest on her 2 grandsons now that she can afford to buy them birthday presents online. And you know what? She can get them a big bag of chips now at the corner 7-Eleven. And she's so happy. Well, this one entrepreneur is given. What they really want for the government is for us taxpayers to do it. I've never been able to do that. I thought it was just the coolest thing, she said. She's unemployed. She said, I like it because now I feel more independent. You know, like I'm in charge. I've really got something that's all my own. Out of somebody else's pocket, folks. Somebody that worked for it. Anyway, Garza's part of an experiment testing the impact of, quote, universal basic income, end quote. That's an old idea getting new life thanks to the 2020 presidential race, although Stockton's project is an independent one and has no connection to any presidential race. Yang, who is running to be our next president, he's a tech entrepreneur. He's anchored his long-shot bid with a proposal to give $1,000 a month in cash to every American as soon as they turn 18. He says the payments will shield workers from the pain of certain job losses caused by automation. The idea has helped him win unexpected support and even muscle out some better-known candidates from the debate stage. His proposal isn't too far off from one by Kamala Harris, one of the top contenders for the Democrat nomination, who has a proposal to give up to $500 a month to working families. I think poverty is immoral. I think it's antiquated, and I think it shouldn't exist. This is a quote from the city, Stockton's 29-year-old Democrat mayor. I think it is too, folks. I think it is too. But are we going to subsidize them? Is that what we want? Is that what we want on the national scene? Another recipient, Jovan Bravo, is happy. This 31-year-old Stockton native and construction worker is married, has 3 kids, aged 13, 8, and 4. He said he didn't see enough of his kids when he worked 6 days a week to pay the bills. That changed when he started getting his $500 a month. Now he only has to work 1 Saturday a month. He uses the other Saturday to take his kids to the amusement park and ride bikes with them in the park and take rides now that he's got the extra $500. He said it's made such a huge difference. Just like being able to spend more time with the wife and kids, it just brings us closer together. Yeah, it is nice, folks. But some of us at work like to spend time with our wife and kids, too. That's why we work. So we've got something quality time with them. Now you want us to support you while you don't work? Wow. Stockton's program, giving 125 people $500 a month for 18 months, will cost just over $1.1 million. Harris' plan, which covers working families making up to $100,000 annually, would cost about $275 billion a year. That according to the Tax Policy Center. To pay for it, she said she'd repeal some of the 2017 GOP tax cuts and impose new taxes on corporations. Yang's plan, which covers every adult in the United States, would cost $2.8 trillion a year. And he would oppose a new tax on businesses, goods, and services while shrinking some other government assistance program. Representatives for Yang and Harris did not want to respond to any interview requests. Garza doesn't know what's next for her either. She relies on her husband for most things, and he recently lost his job. The extra $500 a month, wow, it was so helpful it left her wondering how she was lucky enough to get it, a question she's posed to the program's director. But, she goes, because you're blessed, and I just left it at that. You see, they all want something for nothing. It's kind of like Social Security, Medicare, we all paid in, private pension plans. Most Americans paid into that, and now some of us are getting benefits or hope to get benefits from some of those programs. Some workers gave up money. Union workers gave up money on their salary on an annual basis so they could have a retirement program. They paid into it. Sure, their employer contributed, but they gave up wage increases to get it. And now they even want to put illegals on some of these programs. Bring them in, give them the goodies. They didn't contribute, but they'll take away from those that did. You think it's fair? Is that who you'd vote for? Need I say more? There's a critical point I want you to look at with me. The polls lie about Trump. And I got some information this past week as to how it works. Of course, I mentioned in a previous broadcast that part of it is that a lot of people that are going to vote for Trump don't want to tell it to the church people that they go to church with or the country club folks or the people they work with, they're kind of embarrassed to admit they're all for Donald. But when they get in there, when it's just between them and God who they vote for, they're going to pull that lever for Trump. They did last time and they will again, and I think that's true. But here's something else that I picked up that I want to share with you. The pollsters are manipulating President Donald Trump's approval numbers. Here's the proof. Just last week, Reuters and IPSOS released a poll showing that the president with a job approval of just 42%. At first glance, that's not too bad a number, considering the media's all-out attack on the president, a negative press barrage that's been unprecedented in U.S. history. But the numbers aren't really that bad. They're not. They're better, according to Reuters. Let's look at some poll raw data and polling methodology. This is a poll of registered voters, not likely voters. One Trump pollster said flatly, Donald Trump does at least 4 to 5 points better with respondents who actually show up and vote. We saw that phenomenon in 2016. So this slight qualification of the poll, focusing on likely voters, would push the president's current approval rating from the low 40s to the high 40s. This shift also puts the president within striking distance of reaching the magic 50% mark. The Reuters poll also reveals data, something more startling. First, the survey shows that it sampled 961 registered voters, of which 456 were Democrats, 361 Republicans, and 106 independents. Reuters gave the Democrats 95 more survey responses than Republicans. That weighted the Democrats as 40% of the poll sample, compared to 38 of being Republican. That's a lopsided weighting in favor of the Democrats, giving them a 9-point advantage. The Reuters survey would be accurate if Democrats actually voted in the same proportion, but they don't. Look at the 2018 election exit polls. The turnout was massive, and the exit poll found 37% of voters described themselves as Democrats and 33% as Republicans. It's a 4-point spread. Had the Reuters poll used the same 4-point spread in its recent survey, fairly accounting for Republican voters, Trump would have surged over 50% approval, especially when factoring in, quote, likely voters. Trump poll numbers are good because he has powerful winds at his back. The economy is roaring with historic low unemployment. He has a strong security and foreign policy record. North Korea has been contained. ISIS wiped out, and our allies put on notice they can't take us for granted. And the president's on the verge of ending U.S. involvement in the almost 20-year-old war in Afghanistan. Trump has China on the ropes as he seeks to rebalance our trade deficit. Wall Street is not particularly happy with this confrontational approach, but it's apparently resonating with Main Street and working Americans. That's what the polls are showing. Clearly, the president is close to having a lock on his reelection. One clue of this is a relatively weak field of Democrat candidates seeking to challenge him for the president. If you take a look at it, folks, there's no heavy hitters out there, is there? Story unto itself. Further good news, immigration officials deport 120 Cubans to Havana, and that's just the beginning. Immigration officials deported 120 Cubans on a single flight last week as part of its largest Cuba repatriation mission in recent history. Last Friday's U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement charter flight from New Orleans to Havana was one of many to come. This according to two federal sources, noting the officials have been quietly ramping up their efforts to detain and send undocumented Cubans back to the island. The targeted deportation of Cuban nationals is just a small piece of Trump administration's plan to empty out the country of undocumented immigrants, though the successful removals are the fruit of an agreement by both U.S. and Cuban governments started under former Barack Obama. If they're undocumented, move them out. Folks, the Republicans can win by hammering immigration in the suburbs. Listen to what I've got for you here. This was not a banner week for the anti-law sanctuary crowd. 7-time felon and 5-time deported invader Jose Inez Garcia Zarate was found guilty of nothing in the heartbreaking shooting death of Kate Steinle. As a refresher, Steinle and her father were out for a walk on a waterfront pier in San Francisco. few years back. Following a bang, Kate collapsed into her father's arms saying, quote, "Help me, Daddy," end quote. The fact that Zarate fired the bullet that killed her is undisputed, but he was found guilty of nothing. In other news, it was reported that over the course of about a month, at least 7 different illegal residents were arrested in Montgomery County in Maryland for sex crimes. And at least some of these were tossed back into society, like undersized fish being thrown back into the lake. These charming chaps raped an 11-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 16-year-old girl, some at knife point. These are unconscionable outrages, and in a just world, the politicians who enable them to happen would be held accountable for their role in the death and despair. As with many of the less policies, women suffer disproportionately, since the lawless loans are protecting vicious male predators. None of it should have happened, good listeners. According to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, immigration is fully a federal function, which is why there are federal laws on the books. The states and local jurisdictions have zero equities in immigration law other than an obligation to cooperate with federal officials. Any act to subvert this is a violation of the law. But you see, politicians in these areas would rather send the most violent and depraved criminals back into America's communities to terrorize American citizens rather than cooperate with federal officials to enforce immigration laws. We now have a privileged protected class in America that's more than 300 jurisdictions where they can commit the worst possible crimes with little fear of federal justice. While these politicians tell America they're going to try to protect innocent non-citizens whose only crime is driving with the taillight out, they're routinely protecting and releasing vicious felons. The severity of this problem is shocking. Consider that federal arrests of non-citizens now account for 64% of all arrests. 7% of the population is also responsible for 1/4 of all federal drug and property crime arrests. NBC News tried to downplay these mind-boggling numbers by reporting that 91% of violent crimes are still committed by U.S. citizens. That's another way of saying that about 10% of violent crimes, along with 25% of drug crimes, are being committed by people who should not be here. And that number is clearly on a rapid upward trajectory. This is the truth hidden behind the lying images of angel-faced children at the border being broadcast on the propaganda news networks 24/7. While there are varying degrees of insanity when it comes to this issue, more than 200 cities and 300 jurisdictions do not fully cooperate with immigration and custom enforcement agencies. This includes 3 large cities, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. This concept of nullification of federal law is born out of the Civil War Confederacy. If liberal officials don't agree with federal law, they nullify it under the rubric of providing sanctuary from the offending laws and count on sympathetic judges to provide them protective cover. As Mark Levine noted, quote, "We should call them Confederation cities, Confederation states. We got to learn to use their language. We have a whole confederacy going on out there." We now have at least 7 sanctuary states in addition to all these other jurisdictions. This is eerily similar to what happened to the lead-up of the Civil War, with a host of blue states now in open rebellion against federal immigration law under a Republican president. ICE agents have one of the hardest jobs in the country, folks. They're often asked with findings in rounding up the most dangerous people in the country. Why? To safeguard Americans. The fact that they are reviled and attacked is a national outrage. The fact that one political party full endorses that behavior is a national tragedy. The most illuminating moment of the Democrat debate season was a Democrat's reaction to the request to raise your hand if you think it should be a civil offense rather than a criminal offense to cross the border without documentation. All but 2 hands shot up. Of these 2 hands, one candidate is out of the race, and the others will soon follow. Today's Democrat base does not reward brief moments of sanity. The Democrats are universally in favor of foreign invaders flooding our country and then making them a protected class from federal law enforcement. They do this in sanctuary jurisdictions as part of the new nullification confederacy. Oh, and let's give them tax-funded health care while we're at it. Even President Obama's Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson noted the insanity of his fellow Democrats' position, noting, "This is tantamount to a public declaration, repeated and amplified by smugglers in Central America, that our borders are effectively open to all. This will increase the recent levels of monthly apprehensions at our southern border." A quote from Jay Johnson. You think, for today's woke Democrat Party, that's not a bug? Folks, it's the future. It's a feature. They see these illegal invaders as future Democrat voters. And that's what it's all about. Goodbye until next week.